Hello and welcome to everybody. Our next section on our unit on the Middle Ages is going to take us to the Crusades, and we're going to split the Crusades up into two different parts. Just so you understand, we can use our Crusades worksheet to be able to kind of summarize and organize our notes a little bit more on that. So I would have that out if we still need extra help, because this is going to kind of go in order along with our study guide with that worksheet to kind of give some sense and organization to a pretty large topic. We're going to get through the goals of the Crusades, the definition for what a crusade is, and then the first two Crusades as well. And then the next lecture, part two, will finish off Crusades 3 and 4, and the a couple other Crusades that we want to mention as well. So this kind of works out pretty well, as this will be kind of the front side of the worksheet, and then the back side of the worksheet will be the next lecture, lecture number 6, Crusades Part 2. So the background for the Crusades is that we want to understand that a crusade, in quotation marks there, in the medieval sense, is a combination of a holy war and a pilgrimage that is usually summoned by a pope. Again, you can really get into big, huge, giant doorstops of books. You can spend entire college semesters just on this topic alone. But when we're getting into the kind of true, what do we mean when we're saying a crusades here in the Middle Ages, is that it's a holy war in the sense that those who are going out on crusade to participate in this fighting are doing so out of faith. Uh, it's the belief that the people who died in these conflicts died as martyrs for their beliefs, particularly on the Christian side, going into the Middle East. We'll talk more about that concept later. In the other half of that definition, it's a pilgrimage in the sense that people are going on very long journeys away from home for religious purposes, full stop. That's the reason why they're leaving their homes in London, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, what have you, is to be able to go to the Middle East to reclaim Jerusalem, specifically for religious purposes. And so, because of that, they're going to receive the same material and spiritual benefits of someone going on a pilgrimage. Again, freshman world history class, and we got to get moving and grooving and cooking to be able to get towards World War II at the end of the year. So, we can't dive fully deeply into every single aspect of the Middle Ages. But people would go on pilgrimages to go to the big near cathedral, to go to a holy site, or on longer expeditions. And you would receive kind of, as a pilgrim, you were entitled to, again, and we could get in the nitty gritty, lodgings in some sense, food in some sense, water in some sense, free passage in other areas because you're doing this on a religious experience. And so people going on crusade would carry the traditional pilgrim emblems as well, usually in the form of a cross, that everyone would kind of understand and already would have the shorthand knowledge of, oh, this particular person is a pilgrim. But what we see here at the Crusades is that we're adding a military aspect to this religious experience, this journey of faith. So depending on the historian, depending on how you want to crucify what is or what is not a crusade, you get up to 10, 15, 13, 14 crusades, however you want to describe them. So it all depends on the interpretation of the various historiographers. We're going to focus on the four, where's my hand? There it is, the four big crusades, crusade, the first, second, third, fourth crusade, and then we'll just mention some of the smaller ones that are going to have bigger impacts later on. So that's kind of what we're going in, and what we see here is my head's kind of in the way. Yeah, there it is, head it that way like a soccer player. It's a lot of people going from Western Europe down into the modern Middle East, specifically going to try to get to the town of Jerusalem, and we'll help explain the reasons for that throughout this lecture. So the background for why the Crusades happen at this point, well, and we'll talk about this first point more in depth later in the unit, is that first off, Europe experiencing a population explosion. Europe's starting to burst at the seams here that begins with a global warming period. Begins around the year 950 AD. That leads to longer growing seasons. It leads to We want to say rainy conditions in the sense that more ideal amounts of rain to be able to have Europeans grow more food. And as we've talked about, the usual thing that happens when people are able to grow more food, they're able to have more people. So what we see here from the year 1000 to 1300 is Europe's population doubles. And again, we're talking about not the billions of people on the earth that we have right now. For the continent population to double in this time period is pretty impressive. But this is going to have effects on Europe, and then it's kind of again be kind of feel like they're tightening up. You can kind of notice that hey, there's a lot more people. There's less farmland that's being used very well. We'll talk more about the effects of this as we get into, say, the bubonic plague. And so what we see is the effects of this population doubling is already being felt by the mid 1000s. So how can you be able to kind of mitigate this effect? You can tell these excess people go someplace else. The other thing that we begin to see, and we talked about again with our lecture on European Knights, is that Europe is experiencing capital LOTS, lots of warfare fighting amongst nobles and warriors. So that it's becoming a problem for everybody in society, not just for the knights, but everybody else. So there's so much warfare, so much fighting that people are going to say, hey, if we can't stop the fighting, and remember, they tried peace of God movement, truce of God movement. The Catholic Church society has tried to give these knights and other outlet to do that. Doesn't work at all. So they're saying maybe we can go fight someplace else and take that warfare and fighting out of Europe, go cause problems for other people. We see over time, as we move kind of from the period of Charlemagne in the 800s to the 1000s, we begin to see a growth in religious fervor, a growth in people's faith in what's kind of been termed by a couple of historians pretty famously a persecuting society in Europe, with the idea that there is very much an identification in Europe of what is a good Christian, and therefore, if everybody knows what a good Christian is, we know what someone who's not a Christian is not. So they are outside of this Christianity, they are the other. And so what we see here is that Europe becomes very much focused on how to kind of fit in and become those perfect Christians. So everybody else is a problem, and everybody else is keeping, if you follow, again, Catholic theology, Christian theology, keeping Jesus from returning at the end of days to bring about the new millennium with 1,000 years of peace and prosperity on earth, and then everybody going into heaven because of all these other people not joining Christianity. So we see very much a rise in intolerance during this time period, and this is going to play right into the hand of what's driving the Crusades as well. The fourth major thing that we want to have in the background, the back of our mind for why the Crusades are happening at this point is going all the way back towards the end of our Islamic section. We talked about how that the Islamic world's badly divided at this moment. You've got the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. You've got the Sassanid Caliphate in Damascus in Syria. You have the Umayyad Caliphate in the state of Al-Andalus in Spain. And these different caliphates all have their own political, military, economic reasons to not get along with the others. So they are very much squabbling and being angry with each other, which is going to allow the Europeans to weasel their way into the Middle East at this moment. So this is where it would pull my Crusades worksheets out if I haven't gotten started on them or if I needed any extra help, because we're going to kind of work our way through the list a little bit here. So the first thing I understand is why are these Crusades happening? What's the anticipated result of going on these different Crusades? And the Crusades are going to be launched for various different reasons. So the first kind of set of goals are economic goals. People want to go and make money by going and doing this. So the first set of economic goals deal with merchants. Merchants are looking to use the Crusades to make a profit by making cash loans to finance journeys. It's going to cost a lot to go on crusade. So if Knight Sir Cranmer wants to leave his home in England, right, I've got to be able to get from England to the continent. All right, that's a boat trip. I need to be able to have 2, 3 horses. I need to have someone to help me, my squire. I need to be able to pay for all their food, all the horses' food, and then be able to pay for all my weapons, my armor, my banners, and plus all my personal effects. I need to be able to get all of that to the continent of Europe, through Europe, all the way down to the Middle East before I can even start fighting. That's going to cost a heck of a lot of money. So I can either take that and have, if I have that cash on hand, but most of these people don't. So they're going to take out loans. Merchants are going to provide those loans and loan them that money so I have cash on hand to provide all that to finance. And so merchants like the Crusades because they can make money from those loans. Merchants are also looking to lease their ships for hefty fees to transport armies. If I'm a merchant, I can build a ship and sell it one time to one crusader to go on one trip, or I can build one ship and lease it to the crusader. He gives it back to me, and then I can lease it to another sailor over and over and over again. So that's going to keep driving the Crusades as well as merchants look to be able to try to make money from leasing and transporting the armies. And then finally, particularly merchants in Italy are hoping to win control of key trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean. These are trade routes that have been taken over by the time we get to around the 1000s by the Muslims, by the Turkish Forkas, the Ottoman and the Seljuk Turks that are in the Middle East. And so they're hoping to win control of these trade routes back towards the Italians like they had during the time of the Roman Empire, particularly merchants in the cities of Venice, Pisa, and Genoa. So these are going to be some of the economic drivers of the Crusades. When we talk about it costs a lot about growing on crusade, this is what a typical knight of the Second Crusade would go and bring with them from Europe to Jerusalem. And all that stuff is going to cost a sizable amount of money, particularly if we start moving away from buying stuff off the rack and having it be all custom made toward yourself to help you fight in battle. So that's just what a knight would have in battle. That's not talking about what he would need on his days off, what he would need to help recover, plus all the stuff for his horses. And you start to get the idea that this is all going to add up and it's going to drive not only the knights needing help to get to the Middle East, but also be able to finance that journey. Second set of goals are social goals. One of the social goals for Europe was to get rid of these quarrelsome knights who keep fighting each other in Europe. He tried to stop them, peace of God movement, truce of God movement, didn't work, still fighting. Tried to stop them with chivalry, tried to stop them by giving them tournaments, still fighting. So, like my mom would tell me and my 2 brothers who would be fighting all the time, hey, if you're not going to stop fighting in the house, take it outside, right? Go fight outside, go someplace else. Right? And that's basically what the Crusades do is it gives the Crusaders who or to give these knights in Europe who are keep fighting each other, go fight other people, go kill Muslims, go over there, go fight some other place rather than staying and fighting that in Europe. Another social goal deals with some more actual kind of family disputes and family inheritance issues, and that the younger sons in Europe who are lacking inheritance begin to look for land, position society, and adventure outside of Europe. This deals with the rise of a term called primogeniture in Europe. And basically, what that fancy word means is that, like we saw with Charlemagne's grandsons in the Treaty of Verdun, all right, so this is Louis the Pious's sons. In Treaty of Verdun 843, the 3 sons took Charlemagne's empire, divided it equally, in a sense, amongst them, right? And then they all lived fine and dandy, except it didn't because they all fought each other, became an issue. So over time, what we've seen since then is this idea in Europe that if you have multiple sons, that father is taking his inheritance and instead of dividing it equally amongst all the sons, he's going to give the bulk, if not all of the estate, to his oldest son. And the other sons, too bad, so sad, sorry. So if you're one of those younger sons, you already know when you're born, right? You have this idea that you are not going to get the same amount that the oldest son would. And so if you want to be able to rise up in society or to gain any land, which again, there's a population explosion in Europe, that land is very much becoming a rarity in Europe, you need to go someplace else, and the crusade gives you that opportunity to do that. Religious goals for the Crusades kind of are twofold. One, Pope Urban II, who we'll see is going to call the First Crusade, wants to end that schism that happens between the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox Church. When we get to the First Crusade being called in 1098, that's not very far removed from the schism that occurs between the Roman Catholics in Rome and the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople, when in 1054 the church split, as we kind of talked about in our discussion of the Byzantium Union, over the use of icons and other things in the Christian church. And so the church is split when the Pope and Patriarch excommunicated each other. They were poping against each other, big giant mess. So Pope Urban II is hoping to use particularly the First Crusade to bring Roman Catholicism back to the East and be able to unite the Catholic Church under his rule, specifically in there. So that's one of the religious goals they have. And more importantly, the other religious goal is to reclaim the Holy Land from Islam. With the Muslim expansion in the 600s and 700s, the Holy Land that's in the Old Testament, that's in the New Testament, where Christ lived, preached, and died, is all under the hands of the Muslim forces who are holding that Holy Land as part of sacred to their religion, which they have every right to in their religion, which is the same thing as with the followers of Judaism in there. Specifically, the religious goal is to reclaim Jerusalem religiously, to be able to have those religious sites that are so important to the story of Christianity back under Christian rule and Christian control, as a lot of Christian pilgrims have been complaining that they haven't been able to access sites like where Christ was crucified, like where Christ was buried, um, where Christ was born in Bethlehem. They can't access them, or it's prohibitively expensive because the Muslims are understanding that the Christians want to go there, so they're charging arm and leg. Finally, the political goals of the Crusades are twofold. One, the Byzantine Empire in the East is needing help as his empire is beginning to shrink. It's very much by the time we get to the second half of the 1000s, it's just very much around the countryside of Constantinople. So he's looking for help to end the Muslim attacks on his empire and regain the glory of the Eastern Roman Empire uh, under the heights of, say, of Justinian, of a Belisarius, as well as politically, the Pope in Rome wants to reclaim Palestine. If the Pope in Rome has Palestine politically, that makes him more politically powerful as the ruler of these important Christian sites for him to go back to Europe to be able to get kind of power and control over the kings that are set up there. So those are our four major goals. So that whole first row on your worksheet should be filled out. We want to just touch on briefly that the Crusades very much are the first evidence that Western Europe can launch large-scale expeditions against societies that are more populous, advanced, urban, complex, and powerful than back in Europe. Without the Crusades happening from about the 1000s to the 1300s, we won't see the kings of Spain be able to go out into the Canary and Balearic Islands to be able to go and kind of practice their crusading and their conquering skills from there, which is going to give kind of the extra push for Columbus to go out and sail and for the continued domination that we see out across the Atlantic and then around the world during the great age of exploration that we'll see in second semester. So without the Crusades is kind of the first trial and error for some of these large scale expeditions outside of Europe that we've already seen people in Africa make, people in the Middle East have made, people in Asia have made. The Crusades really are Europe testing its ability to go forward with major amounts of its population out of Europe, and we kind of see the successes and failures that's going to have along the way. The First Crusade is launched by Pope Urban II on November 27th, 1095, at the Council of Clermont. Why this crusade is called is for a couple different reasons. One, very simply, and we'll see this again and again and again, that the reason this is called, the goal of this crusade is to retake Jerusalem. We already saw that is political goal as a religious goal. The main big 35,000 foot view goal of the Crusades is to retake Jerusalem. Now, a subsidiary goal for the First Crusade, specifically what gets this moving, is that by 1095, the Byzantine emperor in the east, Alexius Comnenus, is having one heck of a time in dealing with his empire fragmenting and being taken over by advancing armies of the Muslim Turks. So he begins to appeal to the Pope, asking for help in trying to repel and give him some breathing space on his borders with the advancing Muslim armies. So Pope Urban II at this church council calls for a crusade to go to the Byzantine Empire and then from there work their way south and from there westward towards Jerusalem. Now, the response to this is massive. When we want to go and we talk about this in a lot, if we're talking about the idea of plotting the course of the influence of the Catholic Church on humans since its foundings in the first century AD to the present time, what we see here is that the First Crusade marks the church at the height of its power. From this point, when this is issued, 100,000 people drop their shovels, drop their rakes, and go. And we will not see this happen um, ever again from this kind of time point. And from here on out, it's going to be a downfall in time. The Pope's ability to rally and give massive calls for this. The First Crusade is the church at the height of its power, to where the Pope can deliver this message and 100,000 people, without really thinking, take off and go and take up the sign of the cross, right? So you're going on a crusade, you're taking up the sign of the cross, the crusader, and it kind of goes from there. Because remember, the crusade is this idea of a pilgrimage. Now, what is the benefit for these people to go on this crusade? What are you individually getting out of it other than helping out the Pope, and in this case also helping out the Byzantine Empire? Because there's spiritual benefits to not only going on a pilgrimage, but remember, if a crusade is a holy war and a pilgrimage, by going on this crusade, you get the spiritual benefits that would normally just go to someone on a pilgrimage. And this is called a plenary indulgence, meaning that the crusade could substitute for all earthly penance that you would need to have to perform in order to atone for any sins that you've already done, as well as get you out of all the time in purgatory. Basically, by going on this crusade, you not only get to kill people without any repercussions because you're doing it in the name of God, and you're basically getting a get into heaven or get out of jail free card by going and doing this, because all of your earthly penance from the beginning of your life to going on the crusade is wiped away. Anything that you have to do, any sins you commit while on crusade are also forgiven, as well as any time that you've already accrued in purgatory goes zip, boom, gone, ain't there no more. So that's just a portrait of Alexius Comnenus. He's the one who's asking for help as the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. The knight here in this illustration, as you can see here, he is taking up the sign of the cross, going to this monastery. The monk is giving him this for him to go and take up. This is Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, and it's another view of the action going on. And like we said, there's a major reaction throughout Europe for this. People want to sign up for it. They want to do this. They're excited to go. So in spring of 1096, the first wave of crusaders sets out from Europe, of mostly common people. Of the people, the 100,000 people said, yeah, let's go and take off. Very few knights do this. And this is sometimes referred to as the People's Crusade, as they begin to kind of just take off in the general direction of where they think they go. It leaves before it's supposed to, and it is badly organized, as you probably can imagine. Now, why this has really any impact on the Crusades in general is that basically what they are able to organize themselves to is massacring Jewish communities as they work their way southeastward through the Rhine River Valley in modern-day Germany. These crusaders are demanding that any Jews in the area convert to Christianity or die. And then they are lighting these synagogues. They are killing these people, not only because they aren't aligned with their religious beliefs, but also be able to take anything of theirs that's not nailed down, they're dead, they don't need it anymore, to help use it to finance their expedition. And this deals a lot of in millenarian beliefs with the idea of bringing out the new millennium, Christ coming back down to Earth, 1,000 years of peace, prosperity. We talked about that already. These crusaders fought incessantly with the inhabitants of the areas that they passed through. The king of Hungary actually sends his army to his northwestern border to prevent these crusaders from coming into his kingdom because of how horribly they're acting to everybody else. They have to march around them because of how badly they're acting. And ultimately, what happens to this first wave of crusaders is they're going to be annihilated by the Turks in small skirmishes in Asia Minor before they even reach anywhere close to getting to Constantinople to be any sort of help. So this is kind of, again, the People's Crusade, this first wave of the first Crusaders. They're taking off, they're working their way through there. They kind of get there. It doesn't end too well for them. Um, they're being led by a couple charismatic people, including one character called Peter the Hermit, who, again, is kind of whipping people up in these frenzies of Catholicism, and this is God's will, and leading them on their ways as kind of these religious figures. They are going and hunting down Jewish communities all along their way. We'll see that on the next slide, sealing that down. And this is them depict. This is a picture of Jewish people being burnt alive in their synagogues as their wealth is then being stolen to help finance the Crusaders' journeys as they work further. The main wave, the first big push of the First Crusade, is called the Barons' Crusade. And this is really the second wave of the First Crusade that begins to slowly arrive, much better organized than the People's Crusade, with much more military minded and military trained people rather than the religiously fervent people that we saw immediately go up on take up the cross and go on the First Crusade. Now, when they get to Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor is kind of has changed. He wants to use this as a fighting force for his own empire. The Crusaders are there for their own reasons. And so basically, when we say fight here, it's more verbal arguments than actual physical fighting. But the people who have arrived here in with the First Crusade mostly spend a lot of time just getting into arguments with the Byzantines about when they're going to leave and where they're going to go. And so it doesn't really end well. And this is very much going to create stereotypes of Byzantine diplomacy being hard to follow and being convoluted and unnecessarily complicated, which is where we get the kind of one argument for the origin of the word Byzantine in an adjective that we have in English today. They finally leave Constantinople in the spring of 1097 to work their way towards their goal of Jerusalem. The first major event that happened on the crusade is in May of 1097, where the Crusaders very slowly worked their way towards the modern-day Turkish town of Nicaea. They lay siege to the city, and the people there decide that they are going to surrender. Now, importantly, and this makes more sense when we look at this on a map, Nicaea is very close to the Byzantines. They have very much a long history of working with and dealing with them. They have no idea who these Crusaders are, so the city surrenders to the Byzantine army, not to the Crusaders. The Byzantines are happy. They've got a little bit more of a cushion. They go back home. The Crusaders are totally unhappy with the lenient treatment of these prisoners by the Byzantines. They are very happy that the Byzantine Empire has gone back home. The Crusaders now take off. The second major event that happens on the First Crusade is the Siege of Antioch. This takes place from October of 1097 through June of 1098. The Crusaders surround this port city, don't let any food in, leads to the besieged army and people inside the city of Antioch to resort to eating all their cats and dogs and rats and birds and horses, and accusations of each other before the Crusaders finally enter the city. But it just so happens as the Crusaders enter the city of Antioch that they then find themselves hot on their heels, a Muslim army being rushed from Damascus to deal with them. So the Crusaders lock the door behind them, but they are now locked inside of a city that has been sieged to where there's no food or water in it, with now a Muslim army behind it. So this is very much not looking good for the Crusaders, when at this point a priest on the crusade receives a vision from God. God tells this priest to go down into the basement of one of the churches in Antioch, The priest is told to dig in this one spot, and lo and behold, they are able to make the miracle discovery of the Holy Lance, the Lance of Longinus, the lance of the centurion Longinus that pierced the side of Christ on the um, on the cross. And the Crusaders are inspired behind this, and this inspires them to create a desperate breakout where they very shockingly open up the doors, stream out on their horses, charge the unprepared and totally caught by surprise Muslim army. The army breaks, the Crusaders win the day, and they keep marching on. The leaders of the First Crusade are kind of, it gets convoluted and murky. You've got some Normans from the north of France. You have some Italian knights. You also have some knights from Sicily. So it kind of gets a little bit convoluted, but it's not like one main person is charged. But for the most part, it is a very, amongst the Crusaders themselves, a pretty committed group of people who understand where they need to go. They just have issues of not dealing with armies of this size, which they don't have in Europe. So it leads to a couple of major mistakes that they kind of luck their way out of as they're marching towards Jerusalem. So again, just to reiterate, the first major event is the Siege of Nicaea. We want to take a look at and see here Constantinople is very close to Nicaea. So the Nicaeans are very used to dealing with Constantinople. So it makes sense why the Nicaeans would rather surrender to the Byzantine Empire than the Crusaders who are way off over there. The next major advance is toward the city of Antioch, where the siege is laid, and then from the victory at Antioch, they're going to work their way towards Jerusalem, which we'll get to in a second. Antioch is famous for its walls. This has been a city run by the Phoenicians, by the Greeks, by the Romans, and by the Turks. Very famous for its walls on this port city, which makes it easy to lock those walls and doors behind you, but makes it hard if you're not getting any food or water from there. Right? So the people of Antioch find themselves besieged by the Crusaders, and the Crusaders find themselves besieged by the Muslim army that shows up. If you see in this picture, we have heads of captured Crusaders being catapulted back into the city to spread fear and disease amongst the besieged in there. And we see a similar picture from the time period depicting that as well. The third and last major event of the First Crusade is the Crusaders reaching their goal, their city of Jerusalem, in June of 1099. Just to show you how bad of a time it's been on the Crusade, the First Crusade left Europe with 7,000 knights, and by the time they've reached Jerusalem, it's down to the last 1,200 knights remaining. Again, there's other soldiers in the army, but these are the big, expensive guys that are going to help win. The Crusaders are kind of concerned about marching on the walled city of Jerusalem when that same priest who found the spear of Longinus receives another vision from God saying to dig in the dirt there, and he pulls out a piece of the true cross that Jesus was crucified on. That's the legit one. Don't ask him any other questions. This is the actual piece of wood. And so the Crusaders, again, are very inspired and take up kind of this that God is on their side, and they go and they burst their way and enter the city in July 15th of 1099. When they get in there, and this is something to remember when we get into our next lecture, part 2 on the Crusades, so the Crusaders get into Jerusalem and they slaughter everyone, and that's capital Everyon, everyone during the city, regardless of religion. So they kill any Muslims that they can find, any Jews that are in the city, any Christians that are in the city, because any good Christians would have left that city, so these are bad Christians, so therefore they need to die. There are literal rivers of blood, and none of these might be hyperbole or other stuff, but the Crusaders themselves are reporting that so many people were slaughtered in the city in this capture that the knights would be walking down side streets up to their knees in blood. There's from one of the Crusades books I read, there's a passage where knights describing a small alleyway where horses would have to swim across the alleyway because their feet would not touch the ground because so much blood had been spilt that they were being floated off there. So again, most likely very hyperbolic, exaggerated language, but we do want to understand that very much the truth in that the Crusaders are going in there and murdering anybody they can find because they are not meeting their expectations of what a good Christian would be. So to finish up with this crusade, what are the results? Right? So the Crusaders have done this. So the big key result, and this is something to remember, so hints and winks and nudges here, is that this is one of the very few, particularly of the crusades that we say what's their goal and what happened. This is a successful crusade. So let me repeat that for the third time. The first crusade was one of the few and only successful crusades in that their goal was to retake Jerusalem, and here in 1099 they have captured Jerusalem. The second major result is as they've worked their way down the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, the Crusaders have set up and created four Crusader states, four Crusader kingdoms along this narrow strip of coastline to act as a Christian Western European toehold in the eastern Mediterranean. So those are the two major results. The effect of the First Crusade, though, is that even though we see the creation of these states are extremely vulnerable. They are very much at the far end of very newly created, very untested, untried systems of logistics to supply and defend these Crusader states. So they are extraordinarily vulnerable. If you're the Muslim armies, you are very much don't want them to be here, and these are very enticing because of how tenuously these states are there. So those are that's the major effect of the First Crusade on its taking of Jerusalem. So this is just a contemporary map of the city of Jerusalem from the First Crusade. It's got kind of the major points and places in there as you got a Crusader fighting down at the bottom. Again, the Crusader states that created after the taking of the Crusade, we have the state of Jerusalem, Tyre, uh, uh, Tripoli, and then Antioch, Acre at the top there. So those are the four Crusader states. Again, big thing of them going into the city, taking it down. The walls around Jerusalem have been built, I mean, since the Old Testament days that you read about in the Bible. So pretty formidable effects going in there. Now, take a small little jaunt here. As we're going this, as the Crusaders are working their way through these much more quote civilized end quote or much there's a lot more variety of spices, of foods, of cloths and silk that they usually don't see very much of, if at all, in Western Europe. What we see here at the Crusades is also an example of very much opening the eyes of Western Europeans to the wider world that's available, that's out there, where they might only have heard that through hearsay or rumor or kind of in small amounts and small material objects. This is very much the opening of the wider world, and that's why the Crusades it very much becomes the earliest driver and stepping stone for the Europeans that will eventually see explode throughout the rest of the world in the coming centuries. Like we said, one of the key discoveries along the way is the discovery of the piece of the true cross. So there's a hunk of wood that is said by being told by God to this priest that this is from God. This is from the piece of the cross, the piece of the true cross, and this becomes a extraordinarily holy relic for the Crusaders to have, not only in the taking of Jerusalem, but in setting themselves up as the new caretakers of Jerusalem. And so what we see built in their wake is a couple things that are still in the city today. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the most important Christian places in Jerusalem, even to today. If you know your Gospels, you know your story of Jesus. Jesus was crucified. His body was taken down off the cross and put into the tomb, right? And so again, that tomb was over time buried, forgotten about. Constantine's mom in the 300s famously commissions a church near the site of where Jesus was crucified, and that's what we see here in the third drawing. Again, over the supposed burial chamber. And then the Crusaders are going to build what we see today of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which becomes, again, in there. So you can today go to Jerusalem. It's going to be hard today, and what is this, November 6th of 2023 to go into Jerusalem. Might not be a great suggestion for you to do. But hopefully, when things settle down over there with the big war that's going on, you can go there and you can famously peer in to the tomb uh, where Jesus was buried. And again, the question I usually ask in class is how many bodies are buried in that tomb? And we see all the freshmen struggle with these very fundamental concept of Christianity in trying to answer what's seemingly a very simple question. I'm pretty sure you can kind of, you're not allowed to go in there, obviously, but you can peek your head into where Christ is buried. And again, you can kind of go and see this. To go back and off another side little tangent about this idea of religious orders and the fracturing of Christianity. If you see on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this ladder that's right here, this ladder has been here for 700 years or so. I forget what the exact number is that because Christianity is split up into so many different denominations, every one of those denominations has a say in the burial place of Christ. So because some denominations and again, I forget all the different reasons, disagree that this needs to be moved right here for whatever reasons, it's a major thing. So because they can't agree on it, it's still been there, and it's been there for, again, don't quote me, but 700, 800 years. It's wild. There's a giant fist fight that you can probably search up on YouTube where you got all sorts of monks in different colored robes fighting against each other because one older monk pulled a chair to be able to sit on a hot summer's day, and they started getting all upset and fighting against the other. We don't have a whole lot of time to get into other things that happened to Crusades, but there's new holy orders that are a member. The Knights Templar come about from this there, and the Hospitallers are also a big idea. So I'd love to spend more time on that, but we don't have time. The Templar Knights built the Croix des Chevaliers, one of the big giant Crusader castles they built in the Crusader kingdoms. It's a big deal on there. So before we leave here, we're going to hit the Second Crusade real fast. There's not a whole lot in a big picture that happens in the Second Crusade, so we're going to move pretty fast through this. So the Second Crusade is called because the city and town of Edessa falls to Turks in 1144. Like we said, the effect of the First Crusade is the creation of these Crusader states. The Crusader states are extremely vulnerable. They're so vulnerable that one of them, Edessa, is promptly attacked. So it then falls to the Turks in 1144. So the Second Crusade is launched. Remember, they already have Jerusalem, so they don't need to retake Jerusalem. They already have it. This is relaunched to protect the Holy Land, retake Edessa, and to shore up to make sure there's no further losses to the Muslims. On December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugenius III calls for the French nobles and kings to go on this crusade. Now, he's aided in this by Bernard of Clairvaux, and if this is the Middle Ages class, we're going to spend the next 3-4 days talking about this hugely important religious figure, not only in the Second Crusade, but in terms of Catholicism and Christianity. This is where Saint Bernard comes from. He's a real big deal. But again, freshman world history class, so we just want to emphasize his role in very much being the kind of philosophical driver to the crusading movement to be able to explain not only the philosophical but religious reasons why someone wants to go on crusade. Big picture, again, to get through this pretty quickly, the Second Crusade is ineffective, it's poorly organized. Eventually, they get to the Holy Land and like, well, what are we supposed to do? Well, let's try to go take Damascus in 1148, which is, as you probably know, not a great idea. So the result of this is basically it's a huge debacle. It ends, the taking of Damascus does not work. They're forced back. They lose territory, and it's going to end up ending the crusade. So the Second Crusade really doesn't add to a whole lot in terms of what's happening in world history. That's Bernard of Clairvaux, and again, he's going to become Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. For our purposes, and again, not the most important thing for the quiz or the final exam, but he's a big deal in terms of Middle Ages, medieval history, and he'll become eventually Saint Bernard for providing the religious and philosophical motivations behind the crusading moment. So that we understand, this is kind of, we take a pause and I'll give you a little break and we'll move on in our second part on the Crusades and the latter part, the backside of the worksheet. This is a big deal of what's going on. The Second Crusade, Crusaders are marching along the same path as much as the First Crusaders. So they're seeing the dead bodies, the rotting corpses, the skeletons of the First Crusaders who went on the same path 50 years before, and kind of understanding that this is not this simple and easy thing that they might have been told, which is very much going to kind of give a nice foreshadowing of what the movement of crusading is going to be over time. As we pause here for a second, and we'll move on to finish up the Crusades, the backside of our Crusades worksheet with our Crusades Part 2 lecture.